It's a pleasure to speak to you, and I will take, as already mentioned, a very practical approach to the perspective of public spaces to this conference, taking the example of Hafen City Hamburg, which is one of the most important inner city transformation areas in Europe today, because we are taking at the end of the day a rather radical approach. Harbor-related structures will remain, but nothing in terms of the historical uses basically will be transformed or will be existing. It is a new inner city which is developed at the waterfront. And while commenting on a number of questions, I will start with developing a very short framework on the question of public space generation. We are, in general, talking only about buildings, at least in real estate economics, because they are value producing. But at the end of the day, when we are talking about a city as a public good, we are talking more about public spaces. And I want to explain to you in which perspective and in which way these private uses and the public uses actually are interacting. The first question is naturally the question of generating public spaces as public spaces per se. Legally, public spaces are not in every case public spaces de facto. So what are we actually doing when we are producing public spaces as public spaces? Another important point is naturally how do we really deal with the private spaces which are developed in such an urban environment. And I'm not talking about the spaces of buildings, but as you know, the discussion about the privatization of public spaces is also a discussion about the extension of legally private spaces. So my assumption is that on the one hand side we'll have a necessary expansion of private spaces in terms of economic and economic efficiency on the one hand side, and on the other hand side also for purposes of balancing the interests, the different interests in the city in a new functional way. But it is also possible, and that is my argument, to dissolve some of the potentially enclosed spaces which have been developed in the past, like shopping centers. Although research has been showing that these are far more public spaces as their real ownership actually presumes. So we are not only talking about the production of public spaces in a legal sense and in a social sense, but we are talking also about the transformation of potentially private spaces into public spaces and looking into the social and legal and maybe also the political background. Looking at this agenda, I will start with explaining very shortly the idea of Hafen City Hamburg, which is a project in the inner city of Hamburg, area of 155 hectares and characterized by waterfront development. Actually, there are 10 kilometers of new exchange spaces between water and land which are created. The second major point is that it is an inner city area. You can see the historical inner city of Hamburg, that you can probably presume from this structure that the area of Hafen City is more or less a natural expansion, southern direction towards the Elbe River, if we are talking about Hafen City development. And the only barrier was actually a historical storage city area called Speicherstadt with a linear structure which basically prohibited that the natural expansion ever occurred. So these two features, waterfront and inner city development, naturally produce a framework for development which is in most cases considered to be very favorable for development. Second major background is that we are talking about spatially functional integration, a fine grid urban structure which is to be generated. We are talking about not a suburban structure at the end of the day. And even when we are talking about residential development, it is interspaced with working places. At the end of the day, roughly 12,000 people will live in Hafen City, being spread out over roughly 33% of the new spaces generated, and more than 40,000 jobs, mostly in the service sector, but also retail, cultural, tourist activities are included. Secondly, we are producing also cultural spaces, and in the narrow sense of this word, these cultural spaces are major institutions like, for example, Elbphilharmonie or a maritime museum or a science center. But also the public spaces, to a certain degree, interrelate to the cultural spaces, interrelate to the public spaces, as I will show. Naturally, also consumption spaces are generated. In general, these are spaces for gastronomy, but also retail spaces. And as you can see, in terms of generating the density of contacts, these spaces, the consumption spaces, become very important. Although the major investment may be in terms of cultural spaces, or in terms of residential and working spaces, you can see that people flowing through the open spaces, as I might say in this sense of the word, the public spaces, the consumption spaces are very important because they are the driver of considerable social interaction and density which is created in this urban environment. That has some consequences for the public spaces to be generated. And the public spaces itself, in the narrow sense of the word, also are an important element in the spatial configuration of Hafen City. Naturally, when you're producing a new city, you are establishing at the end of the day also new social institutions like schools, university, cultural environment, and all this must be newly generated, which will be not my topic today. At the end of the day, for you, it's roughly 2 million gross floor square meters which are built on these 155 hectares. The important point in Hafen City is that we are bringing these different functions together. That is often said since the last 10, 15 years. Functionally disintegrated spaces have been developed until the 90s. Even if you look at development plans in a lot of cities, the spatial integration of the uses is rather weak. What we are trying to do is to develop a horizontal and vertical integration of these different types of uses that they actually overlap. That there are residential buildings and office buildings next to each other, that there are even residential and office uses in the same building, that on ground floor the buildings are not coming down as office buildings on the ground floor or as residential buildings, but that they allow for a public exchange with the public spaces at the end of the day. An important element when we are talking about this type of spaces is naturally what type of people in terms of the social environment is actually using those spaces. And we are talking, when we are talking about an inner city, about roughly 12,000 residents. We are talking about the 40,000 employees, students, and we are talking about visitors, 60 to 80,000 on a normal day, when there is a big event like National Reunification Day a weekend ago. which happened to be in Hafen City and where the festivities were in Hamburg, then there are naturally hundreds of thousands. And it is an interesting question what type of spaces you actually need for a social integration of this type of users which are coming to this place. It's not a classical neighborhood. It cannot be a community in the traditional sense of the word, and that has naturally also certain implications. Well, we're talking now about generating urban spaces, and I will show this by looking at the development map of the western part of Hafen City. It is important to recognize that even in a densely built urban area, in a new area, we only have, according to the footprint of building, 37% which is built upon. This produces almost the same density as the historical, it was mentioned, European inner city historically. 21% is actually traffic area. Normally, this is also accounted or considered to be a public space. And naturally, it is a public space, but it is actually a space limited basically for movement. And what is actually produced when we are talking about the rest of the spaces? And looking into the Hafen City area development, you can see these yellow colors that there is a significant amount of private spaces which are actually denominated for public purposes, that you can move in these spaces. There are easements on these spaces that they remain open 24 hours a day. And naturally then there are the classical spaces in form of public spaces, plazas, in this case close to the water, naturally the parks and so on. And in the case of a waterfront development, naturally also the waterfronts, which are all kept open. So when we're talking about public spaces, in this case of Hafen City, we are talking almost about 40% of the spaces which are publicly accessible, although the city is very dense. You can also see that at the end of the day, the private spaces in the narrow sense of the word as those spaces on which no construction takes place are limited to a very small amount. I will only compare this with the neighboring area in Hamburg, in the inner city, which has been transformed in the period between 1905 and 1935 with the major structures, almost the same size. And for you to recognize the traffic area is roughly 40% and the footprint of the buildings is 54%. So naturally it is easy to recognize that the public space is actually one which is traffic space in this case. And all the other spaces, when they are private spaces, are actually building spaces. So the potential we have generating a project like Hafen City is naturally one that it opens up a significant amount of spaces which is not built upon, and other areas which are not confined to traffic purposes in the narrow sense of the word. But even if you are looking, for example, into the urban structure a little bit more in detail, and not only consider that it is an absolute gain and a relative gain in terms of publicity of the spaces, you can also see, comparing on the left-hand side part of Hafen City with the traditional block structure in the center with the same density. This is an area of Hamburg which would be considered a classical European city, that the choices to move in these spaces as a walker, as a bicycle rider, and so on, can be drastically improved. Our classical reference in terms to the European city is, in this case, for example, not the benchmark. It is, so to say, it can be topped. in terms of the policy, and it can be talked in terms of the urban structure to be developed. This has considerable implications, for example, for sustainability strategies in the city. I do not want to touch upon those issues, not only for questions how to use public spaces. I mentioned at the beginning that the type of public spaces to be generated naturally need to produce a high variety of potential uses. Often it is said these spaces must be open to everyone. Yes, that is true. But if they are undifferentiated, if they are producing no variability, then they are, at the end of the day, open to no one. They must provide incentives for and robustness, actually, that people can be living in these spaces, that they can interact in these spaces, that actually uses can take place in these spaces which are unexpected. Naturally, we have been planning for people walking along, or on the right-hand side, that there is a writer reading to an audience, so for cultural activities. But we never thought about the idea that children would be climbing up the walls of the public spaces. And there are a lot of other activities of this type of taking place, or children jumping into the dock. Yeah, actually, we are not putting a sign, it's forbidden or dangerous. It is a result of a natural process of occupying differentiated spaces and coming up with uses which you never expect. And others we are putting in deliberately, a basketball court, not in the backyard, but in the front yard. That is a symbolic generation of spaces resulting from that youths are welcome. And the youths are not living in half a city. It is a mechanism of integration. People are coming from more or less deprived areas, playing basketball, so to say, on the waterfront, saying that is also our place, which naturally produces also conflict with the neighboring residential owners or residential tenants, arguing actually this is our space. That is actually intended as a potential for using a wide variety of public spaces. Let me come to my second point, the discussion about the private spaces. When we are looking at private spaces, we first have to look at the building spaces in the way they are used. And we know from research, many examples, that actually the classical distinction between private and public is not so strong as was presumed maybe 30 years ago. That there is a proliferation of spaces, a mixture, hybrid spaces are actually developing. And this is naturally obvious when you are looking at the ground floor uses of buildings which are private, but naturally, actually, in terms of their use, their intentions directed towards the public spaces or the public-private spaces. That can be easily recognized if you look at the functional structure of the first floor of buildings. I'm going back. Here you see a lot more public uses at ground floor and a homogeneous structure in terms of the building's use develops in the first floor or even higher. There you see actually some of the marketing functions of the public spaces are coming back, not so much in terms of classical trading, as Max Weber's idea was actually describing the city, or Hans Paul Barth's idea, but it's actually gastronomy spaces, where people are eating, consuming beverages. So these space uses actually go beyond the private uses of the buildings, but they are actually, in my view, not a privatization of public spaces, but they are generating publicity of the private spaces in the buildings at the end of the day, because there is a coexisting between compatible and non-compatible economic uses, as you can see, for example. People play basketball immediately in front of the gastronomy spaces, and this is an interesting balance which is developed. And only a minor point I want to mention so that we do not lose this out of sight. Even residential development in such a densely developed area, where you do not have only a street side, but also the other side of the buildings is a public side. And the building space between buildings is a public space. You naturally participate as a resident in public space activities in a far higher degree, but you become also, not only by using the public space, but also being watched. Yeah. You become a member, so to say, a semi-public member, although you are in private rooms. So it's part of becoming a semi-public living in these spaces, also privately owned. The distinction between public and private flows under these inner city conditions. This is a sensible process where actually the people coming into a place like Hafen City are learning, so to say, to become urbanists in a new way. The final point I want to make is that we can also dissolve those structures which are considered to be enclosed structures of the inner city as private structures. And I'm talking now about shopping centers. And our idea was not to allow for a classical shopping center as an enclosed building in Hafen City, but basically to expand shopping beyond a certain area if it is concentrated in a central area of Hafen City. Our argument was to expand it over 8 hectares. This slide shows you 30,000 square meters of retail in a building concentrated, actually building barriers, closed at 10 p.m. in the evening, opened maybe at 9 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the morning, and actually being a very limited public space. Our idea was to spread out the retail function, the consumption function over a wider open space. And naturally that has been achieved. This area now is under construction, and when I started with my work on Hafen City, everyone told me you will never be able to avoid a classical shopping center. We'll see which consequences result from that. You can see also, because it is a yellow color, that it is a private space legally which is generated. So the result is spreading out an economic function which was concentrated in the city, producing a physical barrier to publicity, now actually results in an expansion of private spaces, producing accessibility and an integration into the spatial and physical structure of the city, but producing a risk that all others urban functions are actually limited. I will come back to this point. And you can see what type of urban structure developed. I only want to indicate that instead of a building which is only a shopping center and minor additional function, this is a space where, for example, 400 residential units are existing, and office spaces, and not only retail space is dominating this urban area. So we have a completely different type of stakeholder interest developed through this urban structure. 6,000 people working here, roughly 400 households living here, which have a stronger interest to keep this private space also accommodating for their interest, and not only for the interest of the retail community represented in the retail and gastronomy space. And we are naturally looking also into the question how this physical integration of buildings can be represented in a way that there is no barrier in the landscape. For some of you, this may be difficult to read because at the end of the day, that is a planning instrument. But explaining to you, it is easy to understand that the link between water, street, and other public spaces and the private spaces generated by the development consortium cannot at all be distinguished. People walking through this space will not recognize that they are actually, whether they are in private space or they are in public space. Many of you might say that's a big danger. Yeah. That's a point we can discuss. But at the end of the day, it also avoids the splintering character of urbanism, which has been so much criticized as a dividing line between the urban public sphere and the private sphere. I will, and that was not the conclusion, therefore I skipped that point. The interesting question now is, when we do have this as a private space, and there are good reasons for having this space as a private space, how are you generating public space in this case? And the natural way to do this is naturally, in the first place, to provide accessibility to everyone. In comparison to a classical shopping center, this space, and that is what can be guaranteed, that there is an unlimited access 24 hours a day. The rights of people, and this is the private contract we have been producing, can only be restricted, as it says, insofar as public order and security are impinged upon. And that is a regulation which is the same as in public law for every street. Nevertheless, the private ownership is naturally, in general, free to interpret within certain limits what impinges on the security and public order, although there are a lot of legal decisions from German courts on which one could refer to. You also see on the left-hand side that we are not dealing with public law in this case anymore. We are dealing with private law, we are dealing with easements, with security mechanisms, legal security mechanisms, which are basically private mechanisms. But the transformation of the private spaces into public spaces can be done not by public law, but by private law. And I will show you that we can actually extend on this role by expanding the role of the local state, by changing potential lines of conflict. There are a number of examples. Usually, beggars could be thrown out of this area, or political agitation, or the announcement or the gathering of 20 people against, or hundreds of people against Senate policy, for example, on Moorburg, producing carbon dioxide emissions and so on, could be restricted in this area. But the decisive point is we have had an international competition. And as part of our international competition, we said we are willing to give this space as a private space, but we want to have a very strong legal role for this public space and basically guarantee public rights on these private spaces. So panhandling is allowed. Political agitation is allowed. So if there are elections, for example, there are certain areas where you can put up stands. You have the right. You are not going naturally to the community or to the borough, but you are going to the private investor. But since the ruling is very clear, and then it is already published, everyone can go there and say, well, I will put up my stand of 2 square meters and inform the public in this space. And actually, also, you can gather, if police allows to do that, and march through this area. The interesting point is that is guaranteed by private contract only. But the interesting further step is that violations of the regulations have to be made public, and they are made public, so that there is a disincentive to misuse them. And secondly, there is a fallback option. So when there is a misuse of the private owner of these regulations, then the public spaces, the core private spaces for public use can fall back into public ownership. So this is the interesting fallback option which is generated legally. And the final point naturally is when we are producing such a high degree of density in which different stakeholder interests are actually brought together, then naturally you need other forms of cooperation and conflict solution. And we generated, so to say, an area advisory committee, not only of the stakeholders in this area, but also with public representatives and, for example, with residents from other areas. So we do not know where the conflict lines of the future will be. We cannot anticipate them all legally. Also, we can draw spatial lines in terms of rights where they are preserved and rights where they cannot be guaranteed. These spatial lines, for example, can be redrawn, and this advisory committee plays an important role. So at the end of the day, you have a private space, and our hope is that it actually has more features of a public space than at the end of the day most public spaces have in town. What I wanted to explain to you is, and that may be my short conclusion, is that there is a tremendous potential in contrast to the traditional assumption that major urban developments generate also the potential for public spaces. And secondly, the public ownership of spaces, the private ownership of spaces does not imply necessarily, and I need to say necessarily, that these are in a social and political sense also private spaces. I must also say that these instruments have never been used sufficiently. And when cities do not go to international markets or national markets, are looking for builders or developers which are willing to get involved in such a system of public responsibility, of generating the public goods or collective goods, then necessarily they forgo significant chances. And I think even the classical idea of a shopping center could benefit from those ideas I have presented. Also, even if you are producing an enclosed space, you could make it far more public than has been done in many cases, because in most developments you need public land for this type, and you need a public naturally planning permission. So my assumption is that cities in Europe in general, and I'm not talking about other areas, but in Europe in general, have been too weak and uninnovative stands on many issues which are related to how to deal with the issue of the public in a physical sense, but also in a social and in a political sense. Thank you very much.